August 1945. Across the Pacific, from the flight decks of carriers anchored off Japan to the sprawling airfields of Guam and Tinian, thousands of Grumman F6F Hellcats sit in gleaming rows under the tropical sun. These barrel-chested fighters have just completed the most successful naval air campaign in history, destroying more than 5,200 enemy aircraft in barely 2 years of combat. Pilots called them the Zero Killers. Now, with Japan's surrender signed aboard the USS Missouri, the question facing American planners becomes unexpectedly urgent. What precisely does one do with over 12,000 of the most effective carrier fighters ever built when the war they dominated has suddenly ended? The scale of the Hellcat fleet surprised even Navy officials who had ordered its production. Between 1942 and November 1945, Grumman's Bethpage factory on Long Island had rolled out 12,275 F6F Hellcats. At peak production in 1944, workers averaged 1 aircraft per hour, reaching 644 in a single month, an aviation production record that has never been equaled. These fighters had achieved an astonishing 19-to-1 kill ratio against Japanese aircraft, producing 305 aces and accounting for 75% of all Navy aerial victories during the war. The Hellcat was beloved by pilots for its ruggedness, its forgiving handling characteristics, and its ability to absorb tremendous punishment while bringing crews safely home. Yet by September 1945, this vast aerial armada faced an uncertain future. The Navy's rapid demobilization meant dramatically reduced budgets. Thousands of pilots were returning to civilian life, and newer aircraft were already entering service. The question of what would happen to the Hellcats mirrored the broader challenge facing America's military: how to transition from a nation producing weapons at an unprecedented scale to a peacetime economy that no longer needed them. The immediate post-war months brought rapid changes to the Hellcat fleet. Frontline fighter squadrons began transitioning to Grumman's newer F6F Bearcat, a smaller, lighter, more powerful successor that had entered production just as the war ended. The Bearcat promised better performance against the jet aircraft that were revolutionizing military aviation. For the Hellcat, this meant a swift departure from carrier flight decks that it had dominated since 1943. However, the Navy was not yet ready to abandon the F6F entirely. In April 1946, Admiral Chester Nimitz authorized the formation of a flight demonstration team to maintain public interest in naval aviation during peacetime. This team needed aircraft that were proven, reliable, and impressive to watch. The choice fell to the Hellcat. On May 10, 1946, 3 specially modified F6F Hellcats performed before Navy officials at Jacksonville, Florida. Their pilots were combat veterans, including Lieutenant Commander Roy Butch Voris, who had destroyed 6 Japanese aircraft during the war. The demonstration earned enthusiastic approval. 1 month later, on June 15th, the team performed its first public air show at what is now Jacksonville Executive Airport. The 3 Hellcats, painted in dark navy blue with gold leaf trim, flew a 15-minute performance of precision maneuvers and tight formations. A 4th aircraft was held in reserve. The team also employed a North American SNJ Texan trainer, painted and configured to simulate a Japanese Zero, which the Hellcats would pursue and shoot down during simulated dogfights. The crowd loved it. In July 1946, at an air show in Omaha, Nebraska, the team received its permanent name. Lieutenant Maurice Wickendall had read about a New York nightclub called the Blue Angel in the New Yorker magazine. He suggested the name to Voris, who agreed immediately: navy, blue, and flying. It was perfect. The Blue Angels were born. And the Hellcat became the first aircraft in what would become one of the world's most famous demonstration teams. The Hellcats flew 10 shows with the Blue Angels before being replaced. By late August 1946, the team transitioned to the faster F6F Bearcat. The Hellcat's career with the Blue Angels had lasted barely 4 months, but it established a tradition that continues to this day. Those original dark blue aircraft set the color scheme that Blue Angels have worn ever since. While some Hellcats were thrilling airshow crowds, others were being prepared for a far grimmer purpose. In July 1946, the United States conducted Operation Crossroads, a series of nuclear weapons tests at Bikini Atoll in the Marshall Islands. Scientists needed to understand what would happen to aircraft flying near atomic explosions. They needed to sample the radioactive atmosphere. They needed data that would be impossible to gather using piloted aircraft. The solution was to convert Hellcats into radio-controlled drones. These F6F3K and F6F5K aircraft were stripped of their weapons and fitted with sophisticated remote control equipment. They were painted in high-visibility colors, typically bright red or orange with pink tails, so controllers could track them visually. Each drone carried sensors and sampling equipment designed to capture air and measure radiation levels. On June 24, 1946, several Hellcat drones were launched near the Bikini test site. Some flew piloted practice missions in the days before the first bomb test. Then, immediately after the detonation, unmanned Hellcats flew directly through the mushroom cloud, their sensors recording data that would have been lethal for any human pilot. The aircraft that survived returned to carriers or airfields, where technicians in protective gear removed the sampling equipment. Some of these Hellcats were so contaminated they could never be safely approached again. One of these Crossroads veterans survives today. Bureau number 41834, an F6F3 Hellcat, was built at Grumman's Bethpage factory in February 1944. After serving with several fighter squadrons, it was converted to a drone and painted red with a pink tail bearing the number 14. It flew during Operation Crossroads, sampling the atomic aftermath. The aircraft later served at various naval stations before being transferred to the National Air Museum in November 1948. Today, meticulously restored, it sits in the Smithsonian's Stephen F. Udvar-Hazy Center near Washington, a rare survivor of both combat and nuclear testing. For most Hellcats, the transition from frontline fighter to second-line duties happened quickly. By late 1946, the F6F had largely disappeared from fleet carrier air groups. Instead, the aircraft found new homes in naval reserve squadrons scattered across the country. These reserve units provided weekend flying opportunities for former combat pilots who had returned to civilian careers but wanted to maintain their skills. The Hellcat was perfect for this role. It was forgiving, reliable, and familiar to thousands of pilots who had trained or fought in the type. Training Command also retained substantial numbers of Hellcats. Student naval aviators continued learning carrier operations in F6Fs well into the early 1950s. The aircraft's docile handling made it ideal for pilots making their first arrested landings on carrier decks. An aircraft that would forgive small mistakes was invaluable when teaching young aviators the most demanding skill in military aviation. The night fighter variants enjoyed the longest frontline service. The F6F5N, equipped with AN/APS-6 radar in a distinctive bulge on the starboard wing leading edge, remained in active Navy squadrons as late as 1954. These aircraft filled a capability gap until newer radar-equipped jets could fully replace them. Even as the dayfighter Hellcats vanished into reserve units and training commands, their night-fighting cousins continued standing ready for combat. The Hellcats service with America's allies followed dramatically different paths. The Royal Navy had received 1,263 F6Fs under Lend-Lease during the war. Initially called Gannets, before adopting the American name Hellcat, these aircraft served with distinction in the Mediterranean, off Norway attacking the battleship Tirpitz, and throughout the Pacific with the British Pacific Fleet. British Hellcats claimed 52 enemy aircraft destroyed during the war, but Lend-Lease carried specific conditions. Equipment that survived the war had to be either returned to the United States, purchased at depreciated values, or destroyed. Britain, financially exhausted after 6 years of total war, could afford neither to buy the aircraft nor to ship them back across the Atlantic. The terms of the agreement made the solution grimly clear. Aircraft that were not returned or paid for had to be eliminated. By the end of 1945, only 2 of the 12 Fleet Air Arm squadrons that had operated Hellcats at war's end still retained the type. These were disbanded in early 1946. The remaining aircraft faced systematic disposal. Some were dumped at sea off the Scottish coast, pushed over the sides of carriers, or fired pilotless from catapults to splash into the cold waters of the North Atlantic. Others met similar fates off Australia, where carriers operating with the British Pacific Fleet disposed of their aircraft rather than ship them home. In Sydney, witnesses watched as hundreds of American-built aircraft, Hellcats among them, were taken to the docks, loaded aboard ships, and sailed out to sea where they were pushed overboard. Some were broken up at the Bankstown Aerodrome, their aluminum skins and steel frames cut into scrap. Occasionally, fishing trawlers still haul up pieces of these aircraft in their nets, silent reminders of the thousands of machines that disappeared beneath the waves. One Royal Navy Hellcat escaped this fate and survives today. Hellcat F Mark II, serial number KE209, remained in British service remarkably late. It served as the personal aircraft of Commanding Officer Caspar John at RNAS Lossiemouth until 1952, then continued with the Aircraft Holding Unit until 1954. Today, it rests at the Fleet Air Arm Museum at Yeovilton in Somerset, one of the rarest surviving examples of the type. France received its Hellcats under dramatically different circumstances. Unlike Britain's wartime Lend-Lease aircraft, French Hellcats arrived after the war as part of the Mutual Defense Assistance Program. Between 1950 and 1953, France acquired approximately 124 F6F-5s and 15 F6F-5N night fighters for the aeronaval, plus additional aircraft for the French Air Force. These Hellcats were purchased specifically for combat. France was fighting a desperate colonial war in Indochina against Ho Chi Minh's Viet Minh forces. The French needed rugged, reliable ground attack aircraft that could operate from carriers in the Gulf of Tonkin and from primitive airstrips throughout Southeast Asia. The Hellcat, with its proven reliability and excellent ground attack capabilities, fit the requirement perfectly. French Hellcats operated from 3 aircraft carriers. The Arromanches, formerly the British HMS Colossus, carried Hellcats from 1951. The Lafayette, originally the American USS Langley, and the Bois-Belleau, formerly USS Belleau Wood, also deployed with Hellcat squadrons. French naval pilots flew strike missions against Viet Minh supply routes, bridges, and troop concentrations throughout the conflict. The French Air Force also operated Hellcats in Indochina from 1950 to 1952. 4 squadrons flew the type. But the harsh operating conditions took their toll. Maintenance proved difficult in tropical heat. Combat losses mounted. During 16 months of Air Force operations, 10 Hellcats were shot down, 6 pilots were killed, and 1 was taken prisoner. By 1952, the Air Force began replacing its Hellcats with F6F Bearcats, which offered better performance. The Navy retained its F6Fs longer, flying them until 1954, when F4U Corsairs took over. The last French Hellcat, lost in Indochina, was shot down by anti-aircraft fire over Dien Bien Phu on April 26, 1954, just days before the fortress fell to the Viet Minh. After Indochina, surviving French Hellcats served briefly in North Africa before being withdrawn from service. France officially obsoleted the type at the end of 1959, with the last aircraft discarded in early 1960. Few, if any, survived from French service. Uruguay became the final military operator of the Hellcat worldwide. This peaceful South American nation purchased 12 surplus F6F-5s through Cobell Industries in Texas during the early 1950s. The aircraft were remilitarized and entered service with the Uruguayan Navy's aviation arm in 1952. For a small nation with no real enemies, the Hellcats served primarily for patrol and training purposes. Uruguay operated its Hellcats until 1960, making it the last country to fly the type in regular military service. At least one Uruguayan Hellcat was reportedly preserved in storage for eventual museum display in Montevideo, though its current condition remains uncertain. These South American aircraft marked the end of the Hellcat's active military career, nearly 15 years after the type had ruled the skies over the Pacific. The drone program outlasted all other military uses of the Hellcat. After Operation Crossroads demonstrated the feasibility of remote-controlled aircraft, the Navy converted hundreds of surplus Hellcats into F6F-5K target drones. These aircraft served at facilities across the country, most notably at Point Mugu and China Lake in California. Painted in high-visibility orange, red, and yellow schemes, they flew as aerial targets for guns and missiles, helping develop the weapons systems of the jet age. The Korean War brought an unexpected final combat mission for the Hellcat. In late 1952, Guided Missile Unit 90 deployed to the USS Boxer, with F6F-5K drones converted into flying bombs. Each aircraft carried a 2,000-pound bomb and was guided by radio control from an escorting AD Skyraider. These pilotless Hellcats attacked heavily defended bridges in North Korea, targets too dangerous for manned aircraft to approach. The drone Hellcats flew their attack missions from the carrier's flight deck, just as their piloted predecessors had done years before against Japan. Controllers in the Skyraiders guided them toward their targets, then released control as the explosive-laden aircraft dove into the bridge structures. It was a fitting, if violent, final chapter for an aircraft that had dominated carrier warfare during World War II. Target drone operations continued for another decade. The last F6F Hellcat, flown by the United States Navy, was Bureau number 77722, an F6F-5, converted to drone configuration and based at Point Mugu, California. This aircraft made its final flight in May 1961, ending the Hellcat's 16-year Navy career. The propeller-driven fighter that had swept the Zero from Pacific skies finally gave way to the jet age. Today, the Hellcat has become one of the rarest World War II fighters in existence. Of the 12,275 built, only approximately 17 substantially complete aircraft survive worldwide. Of these, only about 6 are considered airworthy, and only 3 fly regularly. The attrition has been severe. Most Hellcats were scrapped in the years immediately following the war. Others were consumed as target drones. The survivors represent less than 0.2% of total production. The National Naval Aviation Museum at Pensacola, Florida, preserves several examples, including aircraft painted to honor Navy aces David McCampbell, the service's highest-scoring pilot with 34 victories, and Ray Hawkins, the 10th-ranked ace with 14 kills. The Smithsonian's National Air and Space Museum displays the Crossroads drone survivor at its Udvar-Hazy Center. Museums from the New England Air Museum in Connecticut to the Flying Heritage Collection in Washington state display restored Hellcats. Private collectors have invested millions in restoration projects. The Commemorative Air Force operates a Hellcat from Camarillo, California. The Palm Springs Air Museum maintains an airworthy example. The Fagan Fighters. World War II Museum in Granite Falls, Minnesota, completed restoration of an F6F named Death and Destruction, painted to honor Navy ace Donald McPherson's wartime aircraft. These flying examples require constant maintenance and increasingly difficult-to-source parts to remain airworthy. Some survivors have remarkable histories. Bureau number 66237 spent 26 years on the bottom of the Pacific Ocean after crashing off San Diego in January 1944. Recovered in 1970 by a deep-sea research vessel, restored multiple times, and displayed at 3 different museums, it now resides at the Naval Air Station Wildwood Aviation Museum in New Jersey. Other aircraft have been assembled from parts of multiple Hellcats, combining fuselages, wings, and components salvaged from crash sites, scrapyards, and abandoned storage facilities worldwide. The story of America's F6F Hellcats after World War II reveals the fundamental truth about military aircraft. Even the most successful, most numerous, most beloved fighters eventually become obsolete. The 12,000 Hellcats that rolled off Grumman's assembly lines represented the pinnacle of propeller-driven naval aviation. They dominated the Pacific skies as completely as any fighter in history. Yet within 15 years of victory, virtually all had vanished. Scrapped for aluminum, dumped at sea, expended as targets, crashed in training accidents, lost to the inevitable march of technology. What remains today is a handful of survivors scattered across museums and private collections on 3 continents. These 17 aircraft carry the weight of history for an entire generation of naval aviation. They represent the 305 aces who flew Hellcats in combat, the thousands of pilots who trained in them, the workers who built them at an hour per aircraft during the desperate months of 1944, the sailors who maintained them on carrier decks from the Marianas to Tokyo Bay. The Hellcat's legacy extends far beyond its surviving airframes. It proved that American industry could outproduce any enemy. It demonstrated that well-trained pilots in rugged, reliable aircraft could dominate any opponent. It established the Blue Angels tradition that continues thrilling audiences today, and it provided the aerial umbrella that allowed American forces to advance across the Pacific toward final victory. From the flight decks of carriers to the airshow circuit to the mushroom clouds of Bikini to the rice paddies of Indochina to the target ranges of California, the F6F Hellcat served wherever America needed it. The few examples that survive today stand as monuments to the thousands that did not, silent witnesses to the aircraft that changed the course of the Pacific War and then quietly disappeared into history. Thanks for watching. If you liked this video, you'll also enjoy what happened to Germany's Luftwaffe planes after World War II. Like this video, subscribe, and hit the bell for more History Inside.